Hello class, so today I want to offer a screencast in lieu of feedback for recent questions that we've had on virtue ethics as far as virtue ethics is understood by Aristotle. And so I had different setup for different classes, so I'm really just looking at these three questions here, okay? And so let's go ahead and get started here. So we have number one, which is how is virtue ethics understood in relation to reason and eudaimonia for Aristotle? Then what exactly is a virtue in relation to character for Aristotle? And then showing the structure, explaining what is meant by the term virtue signaling. So let's go ahead and step into this question here. Well, let's go ahead and answer 1 and 2 all at once. Okay, so I'm going to try to address some points here that we want to think about. So in light of reason here, as we're getting to eudaimonia for Aristotle, we're reminded of the golden mean, and the golden mean really, as we've referred to, has to do with how it is that we distinguish a virtue, which is this center column here. So courage, generosity, ambition, modesty, etc., temperance. This column here is representative of virtues. And then these two columns here are representative of the excess of that virtue or the deficiency or privation of that virtue. So in this case, you're doing it too much, you're overdoing it. In this case, there's not enough going on, right? So it's a deficiency, it's a negative. And here, this is an excess, okay? So, and that's what we mean by privation, by the way. It's a deficiency, it's something that is missing, etc. Okay? And then so this is the golden mean, and the reason I'm focusing on it really has to do with we want to see the golden mean not necessarily as like an object or anything like that. What we really want to see it as is a principle of rational cognition in terms of rational cognition, rational conscientiousness at work. So in other words, conscientious thinking involves this way in which we're understanding what a virtue is. So in other words, in order to get to eudaimonia, according to Aristotle, we practice the virtues as a way of rationally considering what the excesses are and the deficiencies. And another word about the excesses and deficiencies, we could always see the excess and deficiencies as vice or immorality or problems of immorality, etc. Okay, so the deficiencies and excesses are the way in which we're understanding how we should not act. Okay, but all of this, to be sure, is a way that we're understanding reason in terms of how it is that we get to our aim of eudaimonia. So another thing really to understand too is that I know that students were answering these two questions in different ways. So also know that there's a different combination of answers that could have been provided for these two questions. And so what I'm addressing is just really ways to think about it more, and then also just further clarification than perhaps we've already had. Okay, so you want to think of the golden mean, as I pointed out already. The golden mean really is the way in which we understand virtue rationally. So this is a rational exercise that we bring about in our understanding of moral life, and it could even more specifically be thought of as conscientiousness. Okay, so then I want to bring in this point too. And by the way, too, I want to make a clarification that I noticed that in students' feedback, the audio feedback I was leaving, in a few cases, I was referring to McKinnon and Fiala. And actually, we didn't read McKinnon and Fiala for virtue ethics. We read Mark Dimmick and Andrew Fisher. So Mark Dimmick and Andrew Fisher are the authors. I think I was mistakenly referring to McKinnon and Fiala because I use McKinnon and Fiala a lot. So I want to focus on this question here. So agent-centered moral theories, as Dimmick and Fisher point out, have to do with Aristotelian virtue ethics is an agent-centered theory in virtue of a primary focus on people and their characters rather than singular actions. The point there is that the reason why Dimmick and Fisher are focusing on this point has to do with a distinction that we're making with virtue ethics in light of virtue ethics being non-consequentialist. So in other words, people who are acting ethically for a virtue ethicist are not acting ethically due to a result or wanting a result or wanting specific consequences, because consequentialist theory like utilitarianism focuses on consequences. And so that's really where this distinction comes in. That, in other words, with a virtue ethicist, we're focusing on our character, and we're not necessarily focused on the consequences of our actions. Okay, so the reason why I'm bringing this to bear really has to do with the subtlety that's brought about if we're not understanding this. And so the reason why I'm bringing it up is because I'd like to focus on just this little part here. Character rather than singular actions. This idea here is that, well, we also understand our character by way of actions as well. And we could even say that there are times where singular actions become emblematic of someone's character, right? So, in other words, in acts of heroism or also problems with breaking the law, etc., can be a way that we know someone's character. So I think the distinction we want to make is that the answer is yes. The reason why Dimmick and Fisher are making this distinction has to do with this idea that we're thinking of a building of character rather than focused on our consequences, which is the way this really should be reading. Okay, they should be reading that. They should be writing that. The primary focus on people and their characters rather than consequences. Okay, because with singular actions, that becomes problematic because the only way in which we understand our character is through our actions. Okay, so in other words, this point is subtle, and if we miss it, we're missing an important subtlety that I think is brought about by this distinction that needs some clarification. Okay, so with that said, also remember that was Dimmick and Fisher and not McKinnon and Fiala, as I was pointing out. And then also, too, I want to look at virtue signaling here. So virtue signaling, I found this on this website titled The Conversation, whereby they look to academics to help them with their journalism. So this is written by Karen Stolznow. And so what she's pointing out really is what virtue signaling is. Here she's pointing out that it's a slur right in the title meant to imply moral grandstanding that might not be all bad. So her point really is that virtue signaling still, even if you're signaling a virtue, that you're still perhaps bringing about some attention to a particular subject, whatever that may be. Now, she does do a good job of focusing on what virtue signaling is, and she cites the Cambridge Dictionary, defining it as an attempt to show other people that you are a good person, for example, by expressing opinions that will be acceptable to them, especially on social media. And then she writes, so virtue signaling is an expression used to call out an individual, company, or organization, suggesting they are only backing an idea to look good in the eyes of others. So the term implies that they do not truly believe in the cause they publicly support. They're acting out of bad faith because they have an ulterior motive, or that basically, as we were thinking, there's some kind of hypocrisy there. And I know that some students were wanting to identify this not as a pejorative, right? Because she's pointing it out as a problem of it's a problem whereby you're calling someone out. So to indicate that someone's virtue signaling is another way of referring to them as a hypocrite. Okay, so I think that should clarify our questions so far. So let's glance back at our questions. So in other words, in virtue in relation to character, when we're thinking of building our character, Dimmock and Fisher point out that character is known by our virtue and not necessarily by single actions. I'm making the distinction that, well, we understand our character by our actions. So instead of thinking about single actions, we should be thinking of consequences. That, in other words, we're not necessarily, as virtue ethicists, we're not aimed at achieving consequences, good consequences. We're aimed at establishing our character, okay, to be distinguished from singular actions. So I think really the editing for Dimmock and Fisher really should be in that term singular actions, because our character is understood by our actions, plain and simple, and sometimes quite simply in singular actions. Okay, so why don't we just leave it at that and talk to you later. So thanks, class.